It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. It's called the bully pulpit. Our gregarious 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt, coined the phrase as he pontificated about the evils of monopolies and other mega issues of the early 20th century. He knew that his position as president, his bully pulpit, gave him megaphone power. Every president since then has used that pulpit differently, from Silent Cal Coolidge, who nonetheless held more news conferences than any other president, a total of 521, to FDR's fireside chats, to JFK's televised news conferences. Every president has chosen how to shape his own particular bully pulpit. And now we have Donald Trump, who has set the traditional media on edge with his obsession with Twitter, sending about 4 tweets per day to his roughly 26 million followers. Meanwhile, he has largely refused to work with the media in any traditional sense, waiting 4 weeks after his inauguration to hold his first solo news conference and banning certain media organizations from some White House briefings. Even more, he has repeatedly attacked the media, calling many of the most prominent news organizations the enemy of the American people. Is that just a matter of style, or is the new way our president communicates, as some might say, dangerous to democracy? And what about the press itself? Does any of this even matter when a September Gallup poll showed that only 32% of Americans had confidence in the media, the lowest in Gallup polling history? As part of the Miller Center's first-year project, we have been exploring the risks and rewards of different ways our presidents have communicated with the American people. So our question today, is Donald Trump's relationship with the media genuinely damaging, or is it just an innovative new version of the bully pulpit? Joining us to discuss all this is a member of the traditional media, a legendary one. Jerry Seib has reported for the Wall Street Journal for almost 40 years. He is now executive Washington editor after spending 12 years as the newspaper's Washington bureau chief, and he writes a weekly column, Capital Journal. So he still gets ink on his fingers, but you are also likely to know him from his television appearances. He is the face of the Wall Street Journal in Washington, on TV, and across the internet. Jerry was also my colleague at the Journal for most of 20 years, and I can say on the basis of thousands of interactions around the most important stories in American life, there has never been a better informed, better sourced, more ethical, more fair, more patriotic, or wiser journalist in our country. He is the walking, talking antithesis of fake news.
I'll take that as a compliment, Doug.
It's great to see you.
Thank you very much.
I just laid it on heavy.
I noticed that, yeah.
All true. But so you've been in the communication business for 40 years.
Yeah.
You're at the very top of the game. How is it that Donald Trump seems to be so much better at it than you and everybody else in the business?
Well, look, I mean, for starters, you have to say that Donald Trump is a master at communication. Whatever you think of him, whatever you think of the things he communicates, his ability to control the agenda is exquisite. You know, I mean, he showed it for 18 months during the campaign. He managed to create an aura in which the CNN, for one example, was carrying almost all of his early rallies live from start to finish. There was a famous moment in which Donald Trump had attracted so much attention because of his style that CNN showed during a long stretch of one day during the campaign an empty podium while they were waiting for Donald Trump to appear, which drove the other campaigns crazy, batty. They couldn't believe that this was what was happening. But he had figured out how to take the oxygen out of the room for everybody else. And the part of that was his rallies, and subsequently it's been his Twitter feed. And I think what he does is he figures out how to control the agenda by creating bright, shiny objects that everybody turns toward almost every day. You know, I think that in time that will probably wear off and people will stop paying so much attention to the bright, shiny objects. But for now, he's good at what he does.
people have this idea that the Times is a liberal newspaper and so it would be friendlier to a Democratic administration. The reality was that the New York Times, and to some degree the Washington Post, has been the daily organ of the White House for a century. In some respects, whatever the president said by some means yesterday has always been at the very center of the news the next day. And now Trump is doing it, he's just skipping over the leak to the Times or to somebody else. But so what is it that makes this different from that?
Well, it is a much more conscious effort to cut out the middleman, to cut out the mainstream media in particular. I think, though, that it kind of misses the point of what people who are in our business ought to be about, which is not just conveying what somebody says, although that's important in a democracy, but it's to put it in context, to analyze it, to explain it, to make it meaningful to people. That's still the function of journalism. That's the first function of journalism. And we just can't walk past that because I think in the end, smart, objective journalism still wins out, even in this cluttered media environment.
You wrote a column a few weeks back talking about the president's style of doing this, and essentially making the observation that I think that there's a method to this madness, and it may not be madness at all. But you talked about that by doing this, he positions himself for a negotiation, he's controlling the agenda, and he's creating rabbits for other people to have to run down. And certainly the wiretapping tweets were a tremendously successful way of getting people off some of the problematic issues like the Russia controversy.
Right. Yeah, the subject before the wiretap tweets was Russian interference in the election and potential Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. Suddenly he, in one morning, a Saturday morning, remarkably enough, between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m., makes the subject whether President Obama had wiretapped his phones in Trump Tower or not. Now, I think in that case, he probably went a little too far because there's really no evidence of that at all. And whatever kind of surveillance there might have been, I don't think anybody's come up with any evidence that suggests President Obama wiretapped Donald Trump's phones in Trump Tower. But it did have the effect, as you suggest, of changing the subject to one that was put the preceding administration on defensive rather than the current administration. And that's kind of what you see. You see it sort of over and over again during the campaign. And it is to a certain extent what a president, and you referred at the outset to the bully pulpit, the president has always had the power to do this, to basically find a way to declare what the subject is that's of most import to the country at that moment. He just does it in real time and in a completely different way, and mostly effectively, but occasionally these things blow up. And that, I think the wiretap example is one where it blew up.
I don't think I'm overstating it, that when we all saw those tweets on that Sunday morning about the wiretapping, we also all knew that, well, it's a 99.9% probability that this is untrue. Everybody knew that from the very beginning, and so in a way, if everybody knows what you're saying isn't true, then in a way, it doesn't matter that it's untrue.
I don't think that Trump followers don't expect him to speak the literal truth every time out of the box. That's something we learned during the campaign. And then there's this great debate: should we take the president seriously but not literally? I mean, that's the phrase.
His own people said that.
Yeah, they take him seriously but not literally. I heard his people say that at a post-election conference. Corey Lewandowski, his former campaign manager, said to a group of journalists at a Harvard post-election conference I was at, the problem with you journalists is you took everything he said literally. And you think, well, wow, how else are we supposed to take it? But the message was, don't take it literally. And he's sending signals and laying down markers, but not telling the literal truth. This is a different phenomenon because entire legions of journalists in our lifetimes have spent their time fact-checking presidents. Doing kind of like truth checks and then literally trying to figure out whether what a president or another politician says is correct or not, and long sort of detailed parsing of statements. Well, we're almost, or maybe we're beyond that now because I think people understand that he's sending a signal, not delivering truth necessarily.
If there's a kind of an understanding around it all with the American people, then, what is the downside of that?
Well, okay, so that's a really important question. Let me, two parts to my answer to that. The first is that there's a danger here for the president, leaving aside any of the rest of us, that when he really does want people to take seriously and literally something he says, does he lose the ability to do that by creating all of these previous incidents in which it's clear you shouldn't take what he says literally? There will come a moment in a presidency when you want to be taken literally and seriously and at face value. And I think the danger is that that moment will arrive and he will have lost that ability. So that's one issue. The second issue, though, is that I think the one thing that I learned, at least during the campaign, was that Trump supporters think he's speaking some larger truth. They're not concerned about the smaller truths. They think he's speaking some larger truth. We're getting taken advantage of in the international economy by our trading partners. They're fleecing us. We're piling up debt that's going to bankrupt our children. That's not going to happen anymore. Nobody respects us anymore. We can't stop ISIS, and we're still spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to fix Iraq after 13 years. That's not going to happen anymore. These are the bigger truths that I think his followers thought they heard. To them, that was the point, not the literal truth of any individual statement under any of those big topics. So that's how they have decided to interpret Donald Trump, and the rest of us have to decide, how do we deal with that? He tweeted out one day that Barack Obama released from Guantanamo Bay 122 prisoners who had returned to the battlefield. Right. It turns out 122 people who were released from Guantanamo Bay did return to the terrorist battlefield, the intelligence community thinks, but 113 of those, all but 9 of them, were released by George W. Bush, not by Barack Obama. So you can't let that sort of thing pass without pointing out this is wrong. It's not correct. It is factually incorrect to say what the president said in a tweet. That's where our job as kind of like parsers of truth still has to come into play, I think. Look, I think you're touching on something that gets to the much broader backdrop of what we're talking about here, which is the decline of confidence in American institutions. Least of all the presidency, probably more the press, Congress, the political establishment, the financial establishment. The fact is, people have gotten to a point of skepticism and perhaps cynicism about all those institutions. They don't tend to believe what they're told anyway, right? So I think that's an issue that we have to deal with as a profession, journalism, and we have to sort of cope in an environment in which people are much more than when I started in this profession, inclined to not believe what they're told, even when they're being told it by institutions that they used to trust. And maybe this is a phase in American history, maybe it's just the new reality, but that's the backdrop against which all of this takes place.
Is it also possible that part of what's happening is that President Trump, he does seem to get the American people, and at least an important part of the American people, he seems to get what they want and how they want to hear it in a way that is uncomfortably, to journalists, uncomfortably more effective, more persuasive, maybe more accurate. But is that also a version of just that the media in some respects is a little too big for its own britches? Things like there was big news one night that the Trump entourage left Trump Tower to go to a restaurant and didn't take the pool reporter along. And there was a couple of hours of cable news reporting about the offense of leaving behind the reporter, not telling the reporter where they were going, and how that violated convention. But I was watching that, even as a former reporter, and I was thinking, this sounds really petty. But is that possible that that's the case?
Well, look, that sort of thing sounds petty, but I think one of the things about these conventions that we all operate under is they're there for a reason. It turns out that it is important to the White House to have reporters who can verify where the president is at any given moment. Because at some point, you don't want Americans to think the president has disappeared. That's not a healthy thing for a democracy in a 24/7 news environment. And there's a
hiking
reason.
The Appalachian Trail.
Just to cite one example. Yeah, exactly. I think we have to be modest enough in the media to admit that we missed some things in 2016, right? And Donald Trump saw things that none of us did. He saw this underlying economic insecurity out in the country and saw it as much broader than we thought it was. He saw that people believe that America is losing its edge, that it is being taken advantage of by foreign competitors in the economic sphere and in the security sphere. He saw that people aren't comfortable. They think they're losing control of their country. They don't recognize the country that they live in anymore. It's not the one I grew up in. He recognized all those things and validated those concerns for people, and they appreciated it. And I have to admit that he saw the depth of those feelings more accurately than I think those of us in the mainstream media did. And that's why he won, let's face it.
One of the mysteries to me about this time is that in this whole failure of confidence in institutions, and it's failure of confidence in the presidency, failure of confidence in the Congress, in the media, but also even in our military in some respects. I mean, and President Trump has pushed the boundaries of a lot of these things. His comments about John McCain, not necessarily being a war hero. You said a second ago you were in the Middle East for 3 years. Well, it's not just that. You were taken hostage in Iran. You were held and fortunately survived. And were released. And we were both friends with Danny Pearl. Who was killed by Al Qaeda. I got shot at in Yugoslavia before I got to the Wall Street Journal. None of that seems to account for anything anymore.
People want to know the truth, right? And they have to have somebody who they can believe is a purveyor of the truth, in good times and in bad, in easy situations and in hard ones. Look, if you go into a war zone as a journalist, maybe some people are doing it for the thrill, but mostly you're going into it because if American interests are engaged, American voters, American citizens have a right to know how that's playing out. I mean, that's really what people who embed with the U.S. military are doing it because these are their sons and daughters going to war. They deserve a fair and honest and objective accounting of how things are going. I mean, this is a very basic idea. And I don't think anybody ought to want to mess around with the idea that that's a good function in a democracy, and it's what Americans expect. Now, I think some don't necessarily think they're getting it all the time, and they don't really understand or recognize that they want it nor need it. But I think in the long run, that's what really happens. And so, I think what you do as a journalist, and Marty Baron, who's the editor of the Washington Post, has a great phrase. He says, we don't come into the office every day trying to go to war. We come in to go to work. So just go to work. Be objective, be skeptical, but be fair and objective, and do your job, and have the faith that that's what people are going to recognize they need in the long run. That's really our mission, I think, right now. And forever, really. Not new. It's the same.
And there's always controversy around it as well. And the Wall Street Journal's had some controversy on that very thing of late. Jerry Baker, the editor-in-chief now, but the top editorial person at the Journal, being asked about the dilemma of when the president says false things and how you should report on the things that you clearly know are false. And Jerry Baker made the argument, I happen to agree with it, though it was many people were bothered by it, but he made the argument that reporters shouldn't call these false statements lies unless there is evidence of a kind of intent to deceive. It's fine to call them false, but you can't call them lies because it implies something else. What's going on with that struggle as it relates to the Wall Street Journal?
The lie thing was interesting. I was surprised that it became a controversy because it's not actually all that complicated. I mean, I think what Jerry was saying was simply, if I'm going to call somebody a liar, it means I know that he misled with conscious intent, and that was his goal, as opposed to he just didn't know what he was talking about, or that he didn't have his facts straight. It's very hard to discern intent. So I think all Jerry was saying, in fact, this is what most journalists have done anyway, is simply say, Donald Trump said this, the facts are that. The tweet about the prisoners released from Guantanamo Bay, which simply was factually incorrect. He says 122 prisoners were released by President Obama, returned to the battlefield. Turns out 113 of them were released by George W. Bush. So what we did was what I think you do. We wrote a story that said he said this, but misstated a key fact in doing so, explained what he said, and then said, this is parse out the numbers. Say these are the facts. People can decide whether President Donald Trump didn't know what he was talking about or whether he intentionally deceived. They'll have to make that decision for their own, but I think people are smart enough to figure that out. Nobody's ever communicated this way. Nobody has ever skirted around facts quite the way Donald Trump does. And journalistically, we've all struggled, I think, to come up with how do you deal with that, because we've never been here before.
I want to try a theory out on you and hear your reaction to it. My theory of this moment is that we are still grappling, simplest way to say it, with 9/11. And the Wall Street Journal had a unique experience around 9/11. Our headquarters in New York were destroyed in the attack, and our paper won a Pulitzer Prize mostly by getting a paper out the next day and covering the event, having been victims of it. But my view is that 9/11 was such a traumatic event for this society, the great empire of this century, and it so rattled the American psyche And then it was further rattled by what ultimately became the mistakes around the invasion of Iraq that cost so many lives, cost so much fortune. Layered on top of that, a sense among the American people that it doesn't make sense for families to be handing off the presidency. Doesn't make sense for the Bushes to hand it off, doesn't make sense for the Clintons to try to hand it off. But the whole trauma of this thing set in motion a series of events that were unimaginable before. And that's how we got Barack Obama. It's not because we made so much racial progress, it's that we suddenly were open to something radically different. That triggered a bunch of other things, and that's what gave us Donald Trump. But that in the end, it's all about this giant trauma, a decade of trauma. Is it possible that once we get through this presidency, whether that's 4 or 8 years, that some sort of normalcy will actually come back? That we're not going off a cliff?
Return to normalcy is something I hear a lot. Can we be normal again? Look, I think there's a lot to that. 9/11 is the only, in 4 decades of covering stories, it's the only story I've ever covered where the moment it happened, you knew, you could say, we talked about it instantly, that things will never be the same. It's the only story I've ever covered where that was immediately clear. Things will never be the same. And that's true. Why were they never the same? Because I think it made Americans feel vulnerable. And I think that I agree with the theory in the sense that it was a profound change for Americans to feel like they were personally vulnerable. Couple it with a feeling that Americans had lost control of their economic destiny. And I think there are 2 factors there. I think one was technology, which turns out to be great, except when it takes your job away. That's not so very good. And globalization of the economy, which people were told in the 1990s was going to be an unmitigated plus. And I talked to a woman last week that I lost my job down in Wise, Virginia, not very far from here, because the factory where I was a seamstress closed down and moved to Honduras. Well, people thought, well, we've lost control of our economic destiny as well. And then there's a kind of a multiculturalism that some people, I'm one of them, celebrate, because I think America is powerful because it's multicultural and it's a melting pot and all that. It scares some people at the same time. So you pile all those uncertainties one on top of the other, and you get a feeling that people have that they've lost control. And they don't like that, because we're Americans. We're supposed to be in control of the world. And I think Donald Trump arrives and says, I'm going to put us back in control. I'm going to put you back in control of your economic life, and I'm going to put America back in control of the world and the way it works. And that was a comforting message. Even Trump supporters don't expect him to turn all these forces around. He may say that he's going to do that. I don't think that's what they believe or expect. I think they just want him to get the trend lines moving in the right direction. So, if he saves some American jobs, as he has to some extent already, that'll make people think it's possible that we can turn this around. And if he basically makes NAFTA work better for people like the woman who lost her job at the textile factory, well, then people think, well, it's possible. So I don't think he has to turn everything around. I think he has to show that he can switch the trend lines on some of these key things. I think the danger is that some people maybe did take the promise literally. And he says, I'm going to bring all the coal jobs back to Virginia or Kentucky, and that doesn't happen, then what's the level of disappointment? I mean, that's probably the danger. And if you're a sort of a 50-year-old, 55-year-old blue-collar worker in the Midwest, and it turns out the factories don't come back, what's the level of disappointment? Where does that leave people? And that's, I think, the other danger that he faces right now.
All right, journalists don't like to give advice to anybody. You like to just criticize people. But in this case, I think it's relevant to ask you to give some advice. Young new reporter at the Wall Street Journal comes to see you a few months after he started in the bureau and says, "Okay, old man, been here so long. Tell me how to succeed. What's your one piece of advice for that young reporter?"
Be honest. Be honest and have confidence that honesty wins out. Don't worry about how you do it. Just worry about the forms of journalism. The forms of journalism are changing and will continue to change. What will not change is the reason journalism exists, which is to be a purveyor of fair and objective information to people who need it and actually want it, even if they won't admit to you at that moment that they really do want it. So have faith.
Last thing, what's your one piece of advice for the American people?
I'm an optimist. This transcends journalism, and it doesn't matter what I think all that much. But I will, people say, the country's in terrible shape, and it was better in the old days. I mean, I lived through the 1970s. Things weren't so great in the 1970s. It's like I think America is stronger than it's ever been. I think it's more vibrant than it's ever been. I think there's more innovation going on in this country than there's ever. There's an economic transformation, but I would say, relax. This is a great country. It's as great as it's ever been, and it's going to get greater, and I don't have any doubt about that.
Sounds like good advice. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
We hope you'll join us for future editions of American Forum, where our focus is always on the presidency and the issues facing our nation. In upcoming episodes, Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz on the president and the economy, conservative icon Bill Kristol, and historian and author John Farrell on his new, much talked about biography, arguing that Richard Nixon, while running for president in 1968, attempted to sabotage peace talks between the U.S. and Vietnam. You can watch those programs on your local PBS affiliate, or to join our ongoing conversation, look for us on the Miller Center Facebook page, visit our new revamped website at millercenter.org, or follow us on Twitter. My handle is @DouglasBlackman. Jerry Seib is @Gerald F. Seib. See you next week.